I'm going to talk about the model view controller pattern. This is basically a way to create programs in a way that is modular, it's easy to modify, and it makes sense. It's easy to transform. Okay, so you can always create a program in one big file, everything that the program needs. But as more programs get more complex and more interactions are there with your program, so for example, in a mobile application or in a graphical user interface, or in many other cases, the more interactions you have with your program, the more you want to separate the parts so that you can code each component correctly. And then if something changes, you just change that part without having to change the rest of the components. That's what design patterns aim to do. And today I'm going to talk, like I said, about the model view controller pattern. In the model view controller pattern, you have basically three main objects, or three main classes if we're talking Java or C++ or Objective-C. You'll have a model, which represents the data and the rules of access to that data. Okay, so the model is basically an interface to your database or some way of manipulating data and data alone. Okay, the view basically looks at the model and renders the content. So for example, in the view, you might have like a window that displays the value of some name, and that name, the actual string with that name, is in the model. And then controller basically translates the interactions of the user with the view and the modifications that they make in the model. Basically, the controller is the glue that makes the view talk to the model and vice versa. So in a nice diagram form, for example, we have the following. Let me move this here. There you go. We have a controller class. We have a view class and a model class, a model object. Okay, so with the view, the user interacts with the view with buttons and text boxes and whatever. When the user interacts with that and sends a meaningful action, right, that action is sent to the controller. This is an action that will modify data. That action is sent to the controller. The controller then says, oh, I have received this action that makes me modify my data. So then it goes and updates the model. Then the model might update immediately or might actually go to a database or to the internet or something. But once it updates, it gets the data, pure data. It notifies the controller and it says, controllers, I got my data. Now you need to find a way to display it. So then the controller talks to the view and updates the view. So whatever fields need to be updated so that the data that the model brought can be displayed will be updated. Let's do a little demonstration of this with a little application. I have this really simple calculator in MVC. This just multiplies whatever number, this just multiplies this total by whatever number you want. So in the input you put a number, so for example 2, and that's going to multiply 1 by 2 and put it in the total. If you do 4, that's going to multiply 4 by 2, which is 8, and put it in the total. And if you put 49, it's going to be 49 times 8, and it'll be put in the total, and so on and so forth. If you click on clear, then it goes back to 1. That is our very simple calculator. Now, the view is what you see here, these interactions. The model, you don't see it, but the model should contain, for example, 2 times 1. This total, or the current total, the actual numbers are displayed here, but they are stored in some model. Okay? Now, for this little program, to have a particular model might be a little bit of over-engineering this problem. But the point here is that this is this input. Okay, so if I put the input 20 and multiply, this 40 is stored in the model because that's the persistent data. That's the data that we care about. This 20 is just here in the view. When I click multiply, the view will say to the controller, hey, whatever is in the model should be multiplied by 20. The controller then The view tells the controller, hey, multiply whatever I have in the total by 20. Then the controller goes to the model and says, hey model, what do you have in the total? Why don't you multiply that by 20 and give me the result? The model will say, okay, the result is 40. Give it back to the controller. And then the controller will say, okay, view, display the value 40. Okay? And that's basically how the interaction goes. So let's look at the code in Java of how to do this. Let's look at the view first. For the view, you basically create this view. Okay, you create a text field, you set it to editable. For example, this is the total text field, right? It's not editable, you didn't set it to editable. Then you have a JPanel where you're going to place all these buttons. You're going to have a new JLabel input, and then etc. etc. You're basically going to lay out these components. If you don't know how to lay out these components in Java, or how to paint basically this user interface, you should look at some of my videos under a playlist called Programming 2 in Java, mostly working with GUI, so graphical user interface in Java. All right, so that's basically you're putting together the view. There are a few more things to do with the view too. I'm going to have a reset method that basically will set the total text field. The total text field, remember, is this guy. This is my calculator. This is my calculator. This is my total text field. This field here. Okay, I will set it to some initial value, which is 1, right? So 1. Now, I will have a getter for the user input. So whatever I put here in the input, okay, whatever in the input, I will just get it. Return the user input text field, which is the name of this text field, .getText. I will also have a setter for the total. If I'm giving a string with a total, the string 45, for example, I'm just going to set that total. I will have a method show error with a message that will just basically open up a dialog with an error. So for example, if I enter 45A, that will show an error and it'll say bad input 45A. Right? Let's show error. And then I will have two methods. These methods are really important. These two methods here. Whoops. First, add multiply listener. This goes to the multiply button, which is this one, the one that's highlighted. Multiply button, and it will add an action listener, meaning it will add an action listener object that will execute something when you click multiply. And the same thing with add clear listener. We'll add a listener, an action listener, to the clear button. The action listener object is basically the one that will do something when you click on clear. Okay? So we will just have these methods to add any action listener we want. But remember, the one who's going to be listening is going to be the controller. Okay? So we're going to have the controller add a multiply listener and add a clear listener to the view. Let's look at the model now. Now the model only accesses the data. We're going to have a calc model, okay, with an initial value of 0, but that's changed later. We're going to have an object big integer, okay, called mtotal. That is just big integers have this particular big integer objects have this particular method that they can actually create a value from a string, and it can be a large integer. So upon constructor, so when we first construct the model object, it will reset. What does reset do? Reset sets the total to the initial value, to a big integer with the initial value. Now multiply by, and you give it a string with a number in it, will basically, the mtotal will multiply it by this new big integer here. Set value will basically set the mtotal to whatever value I give it in the string, and get value will basically return the total value as a string. Why am I using strings? Well, because at some point I do all my operations with big integers, but I return and receive strings because that's what the view is going to send me. That's what the controller is going to send me. Now, in this particular case. Now, let's look at the calc controller and see how everything is glued together. So I'll bring my calculator here. Well, first I have a calc controller class that receives in the constructor a model class, a model object, and a view object. First I set a member variable model to the model that you passed, a member variable view to the view that you passed, and then the next thing is I set the model. In the model, I set the value to the initial value, okay, whatever that is. So the model has an initial value. Then, in the view, I will put total text field. I will set the text in the view. I will set the text to, in the view, I'll set the text to whatever the value I get from the model. So whatever this initial value is. This initial value is going to be 1 for the actual implementation. But so I go to the model, get the value of the total, which is going to be 1, and then in the view, set that field's text to that. So when you first start this thing, it'll be like this. It'll set the number 1 in the total. And it comes from the model, but it sets it in the view. Then what I will do is tell the view what to do when I press the button. So the view is going to notify me that it pushed the buttons, and this is how it's going to do it. In the view, I will add a multiply listener, and I will create a new multiply listener. This is an object that I create, and I'm going to show you later how I created it. And in the add clear listener, I'm going to add a clear listener, which is an object I created specifically to handle the push of the clear button. The new multiply listener, and multiply listener is an object that I created specifically for the multiply button presses. How do we create these objects? In the controller, in a separate class, you create the two classes. Class multiply listener, it needs to implement the action listener interface, which has one method, action performed. That's the one method. And this is what's going to happen when this multiply listener listens to an event, namely a button click. The same thing for the clear listener. So let's look at the clear listener first. It implements the action listener, which has this method, action performed. Basically, when the clear listener is called, I will reset the model and reset the view. That's what I do. And when the multiply listener is called, I will get the user input from the view get user input. Then in the model, I will multiply whatever the total is by that user input. And then in the view, I'm going to set the total field with the value from the model. That's all. And if there's an exception, I will show error in the view. That's all it does. And then you can see it working here, right? So 3 multiplied times 1, that puts something in the model. If I do clear, it resets both the model and the view. And this is basically how you do a model view controller class. Now these classes, of course, are not complete. The code can be found on the website for the class.